Welcome back to Brian Keene's Secret Histories. I am Brian Keene. Today we are going to be talking about Ghoul. I suspect this will be a very long video, so we don't need any preamble. Let's just get right into it. Ghoul is, of course, a coming-of-age novel set in 1984. As far as popularity goes of my works, it is second only to The Rising in popularity. This is the one, other than The Rising, that fans and readers bring up the most, have the most questions about, ask if there's ever going to be a sequel, etc. So let's try to get into all of that. As we do, I guess we should start with the origins of Ghoul. At this point, when the book was written, I had become very successful. I was writing full-time, meaning that it was my only job. I was able to support my family based on what I was writing. I was often writing 7 or 8 hours a day, except that would often turn into 13, 14, 15 hours a day. When I wasn't writing, I was out on the road promoting what I'd written. So while I was able to support my family, I wasn't really being supportive of my family. We talked about that a bit when we discussed Dark Hollow in an earlier video and some of the other things. We talked about it a lot more when we discussed Running with the Devil. And we're going to get into it pretty heavily later on in this series. But for today, we won't, because for today, in my mind, as this book was being written, I was pretty content, and I thought things were okay. I had a new deal to sign with Leisure Books, and they wanted to do a 2-book deal. I knew that one of those books was going to be Dead Sea, because I got the idea for Dead Sea, and it didn't involve Sikwasim zombies. It wasn't related to The Rising at all, and I thought, boy, that would be fun to write. The other novel, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I had a few different ideas I was playing with. One day I visited my parents, and while there, I walked up to a local church above their house and the cemetery therein. I had grown up in the shadow of that church. That cemetery had been one of my many playgrounds. And as I was walking around, I lit a joint and smoked a joint, had a little bit of bourbon that was in my truck, and I had a Moleskine notebook with me, and all these memories from childhood started coming back. Not just there in the cemetery, but all around the surrounding countryside. Various woodland areas and forests where we had built various clubhouses and forts. The flea market that I used to go to, the newsstand where I had my first job, the pond where we used to ice skate and where I fell through the ice, almost died. All this stuff started coming back to me, and I was surprised by how much of it I had just forgotten or chose not to remember over the years. I grew up in the 70s. I was a kid in the 70s, and I was a teenager in the very early 80s. And I cannot say that my parents were abusive, because they were not. I have good parents. But parents in general in that era, you know the Who song, The Kids Are All Right? The kids may have been all right, but the parents were pretty fucked up. Um, this country, it was dealing with the aftermath of Vietnam. It was dealing with the aftermath of the assassinations of Martin Luther King, JFK, Malcolm X, RFK. It was dealing with the aftermath of Kent State, um, the death of the peace and love generation. If you look at horror at the time, you had films like Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Exorcist, and you had the early works of authors like James Herbert, Stephen King, F. Paul Wilson, Dean Koontz. I will argue to my grave that all of these were a subconscious in most cases, and in some cases fully conscious answer to everything that was going on in this country at that time. Now, I know that today in 2025, our situation seems dire, and this country feels like it is divided and tearing itself apart. I would argue that a same sort of malaise lay over us in the early 70s. Every single parent I knew, looking back now with the wisdom that comes with adulthood, every single parent I knew was fucked up in some way. Some of my childhood friends were physically abused. At least one of my childhood friends was sexually abused. Uh, as I said, I was never abused by my parents. My parents were good people, but my parents were also dealing with a lot. My father served in Vietnam, 82nd Airborne, came home, still had a year left, and he was on riot duty in Detroit, Washington, D.C., and elsewhere. I have often believed that perhaps riot duty messed him up worse than the war did. And in fact, one of his best friends, a black guy, I don't want to say his name on the video to protect his privacy. He's long since passed, but he became the basis for the character in the complex, the Vietnam vet who comes back and goes to riot duty and gets called an Uncle Tom and all that. So yeah, there's no doubt that that experience messed my father up. And while he was working through that, because in the 70s, I mean, I guess talk therapy existed as a concept, but men weren't going to it. Certainly not blue collar men like my father. While he was dealing with all this, he was working 7 days a week shift work at a paper mill. So I rarely saw him. And when I did see him, often I was getting disciplined for something. So there was a sense of being ignored, being forgotten. My mother, she was dealing with everything my father was going through. She was also dealing with the death of her younger brother. He died when I was about a year and a half old in a car accident. So it's fair to say both my parents were dealing with some PTSD. And while they weren't abusive, I was often left to my own devices. I was often a pretty lonely kid until I began to make friends with people. I think that's why comic books and later horror novels and science fiction novels and fantasy novels were so crucial to me. They gave me a connection with others. You know what I mean? Anyway, I started thinking about all this, and I'm sitting there in the cemetery and looking where all our old clubhouses were. The clubhouse in Ghoul, the dugout, was in fact a real thing. We spent an entire summer building that, my friends and I. And it was a marvel of 14-year-old engineer, 12 to 14-year-old engineering. The only adult, to the best of my knowledge, that ever found it was my grandfather. Now, my grandfather was a moonshiner. Never graduated high school. Uh, I think he made it through the fourth grade. He was from West Virginia. When he was in trouble with the law, he'd head across the border to Kentucky. When he got in trouble with the law there, he'd come back to West Virginia. This is my paternal grandfather, my father's father. Um, my grandfather was a rebel and an outlaw in every sense of the word. Um, he lived on the outskirts of Lewisburg, West Virginia. During Prohibition, uh, he was the only moonshiner in the area who, because at the time, the town of Lewisburg was segregated. You had the black side and the white side. He was the only one that would sell moonshine to the black side. Every Sunday morning, he would load up his truck with moonshine, and he would take my father with him. They would tell my grandmother that they were going to church, and in fact, they, you know, drove through the segregated side of Lewisburg. And he supplied all the black speakeasies. He had many friends there. Um, so it cannot be stated enough. I mean, in 2025, you'll still find plenty of racists in West Virginia, but West Virginia was even more racist back then. And yet, my criminal grandfather raised my father differently. Raised him not to see the other, but to see people just like they were. And I think that's important. But in his old age, my grandfather came to live with us for a year. He and my mother did not get along, and eventually he had to go to an assisted living home. He and my mother did not get along because he was a criminal and an outlaw, and because I was a budding criminal and outlaw. And he sort of took me under his arm that year. Under his tutelage, I became a better criminal and outlaw. But he found the clubhouse and he kept it secret. So much of this novel is just true. The clubhouse, the map, the cemetery, the bullies. And I remember standing there in that cemetery and pulling out my moleskin notebook. The weed had really kicked in by then, as had the bourbon. And I wrote the first chapter of Ghoul, the prologue, sitting on top of a tombstone. I pitched it to Don Daria at Leisure Books, along with Dead Sea. I pitched a third book as well. I couldn't remember what. And I told him, pick two. He really liked the idea for Ghoul. Originally, it was called Ghouls, plural. He suggested I change that because he thought it gave away too much of the message behind the novel. That it turns out the real monsters are the parents, the adults. Don was very light with edits on Ghoul. Now, we said in an earlier video that Dark Hollow was the last time I ever got any editorial interference from a publisher. And by that, I meant, changing titles and this and that. But Ghoul, other than, suggesting making it singular rather than plural, Don was very hands-off with this one. I think he knew that this was a personal story, an important story, and I think he knew how well the genre was going to receive this. Same thing goes for Shane Staley at Delirium Books. He was also very hands-off with the edits. And so I wrote Ghoul. Most of it was written at home. At this point in my career, We had a cabin down in West Virginia, so some of the book was written there. Most of it was written at home. Um, and so many of my personal experiences informed this book. I was the character of Timmy Graco. Um, I did have an adult pick me up and slam me against the wall of the shed. We did sneak out at night and go running around the neighborhood. I did have a little childhood sweetheart who just a few years later would become a very real sweetheart. Um, I did feel powerless to help my friends. I did read all these comic books where these heroes had superpowers and they could do it. And Batman didn't have superpowers, but he could still do it. And I couldn't do anything. And I felt so frustrated by that. It should be noted in the novel, Timmy has two friends. Um, in real life, there were 9 of us that palled around. And I sort of condensed, made these crazy patchwork quilt characters out of parts of each of us. Um, but yeah, we talked about Dark Hollow, about bleeding on the page, and about infusing our fiction with real life. This is one of the moments where I really got real in a way that I would not do again until the complex, which was many years later. Fans have asked, will there ever be a sequel to Ghoul? I have an idea for a sequel. I have the whole thing plotted out in my head. And there have been times where I have attempted to start writing it. But something happens. I always end up having to work on other projects. It fizzles, it falls apart. I will point out that in Ghost Walk, I believe it is, there's a segment, a conversation between Adam Seneft and Levi Stoltzfus. If you read that segment carefully, you will see the setup for the sequel to Ghoul. That's all I'm going to say about that because I don't want to give spoilers. Ghoul, of course, I've had a number of works adapted for film. Ghoul was the only one adapted for feature film. Reader and fan opinion varies on the movie. Some people genuinely like it. A lot of people genuinely don't. I'm not going to give my opinion. I think that's crass. I think it's not cool. I will say that, I got to be on set for 2 weeks, which was delightful. There was a moment where I went to the soundstage. We had the same soundstage that they had used for Battlefield Earth. In fact, we shot there right after Battlefield Earth, and some of their set was repurposed for the Ghoul set. Part of that was the dugout, the clubhouse. I had a moment where I walked into my childhood fort, the dugout, rebuilt in this airline hangar-sized soundstage. And it was meticulous. And I did not realize until that moment just what a good job I'd done describing the fort in the novel. Because, the set designer and the special effects guys said, yeah, we built it exactly like you wrote it in the novel. I had to call my friends, all 9 of them, from inside and say, you'll never believe where I'm standing. And it was such a neat fucking moment. Loved being on set, loved the cast. And of course, when the film debuted at Sundance and Slamdance, that was a real treat. I got to take Mary. She and I had been dating for, I guess, a year at that point. And got to take Todd Clark and Mark Silva, who have pre-read for me for a long, 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 long time. They're my longest serving beta readers. And I got to take author Mike Oliveri and author and editor Mikey Hike, and we just had the best fucking time. Um, so let's take a look at the various versions of Ghoul. I feel like there was more I wanted to say about this, but I guess I covered it all. Let's start with the Delirium Books limited hardcover edition. Always love this cover. I hate doing this with one hand. There we go. It was limited to 500. Signed by me. Love the little doodle here. And then there was the lettered edition. Which, similar to the limited edition, except that it was lettered. Different end papers, different binding, etc. The edition that most of you are probably most familiar with is, of course, the Leisure Books edition. Like this cover, the joke, of course, is that Leisure put hands on most of my covers, and they did. But I've always liked this cover. I'm fond of it. I don't have a problem with it at all. Bram Stoker award-winning author of The Conqueror Worms, I thought was a little bit wordy, and I really reiterated in my mind that we should have gone with Earthworm Gods, but, I was past that point in my career. But yeah, that was the mass market paperback. This went through, I believe, 6 or 7 printings. So, pretty common, pretty easy to find. There was also the Deadite Press edition, which used the movie poster as its cover. I don't know if you know, but there was a second movie poster for streaming. And that was this. This is the DVD of Ghoul. When it went to streaming, Nolan was in Modern Family, which was a huge success at that point. So they really wanted to capitalize on his role in the film. So they went with this for streaming instead. Another paperback, mass market paperback sized edition is this one, which came from Nightworms. It was exclusive to their pack. Nightworms is one of those companies where you pay money and you get a book like every month. You get a package of books. You know what I mean? And this was theirs. I did write a new introduction for that one. That's probably a little harder to find. There were also several audiobooks editions. This one, which is audio CDs, was produced by Audio Realms, who were a terrible fucking company. Audio Realms did CD versions of The Rising, City of the Dead, Ghoul, Urban Gothic, and Castaways. I never got a fucking dime. Well, maybe that's not true. Maybe occasionally I got paid if I made enough noise. But they went out owing me countless dollars. Terrible fucking company. There was a better audiobook released by Crossroad Press, Chet Williamson as the narrator. We talked about him in our last video. I love Chet's stuff. A lot of foreign editions. Other than The Rising, this is probably my most translated novel. I'm not going to show you all of them, or we would be here all day, but I will show you a few. This is the German mass market paperback. Very cool. This is an Italian trade paperback. Also very cool. Here's a Polish edition. And a rarity, Russian, not only Russian mass market paperback, but Russian hardcover, trade hardcover as well. I found it interesting that in Russia they put an age warning on the books. Um, so that is Ghoul. I'm trying to think if there's anything I didn't cover. I feel like there's. Oh, I know. So, as I said, I grew up in the 70s. The book is actually set in 1984. Now, in 1984, I was a teenager. I was the age of the older kids in the book. Um, but I set it in 1984 for a very specific reason. The age of my readers, the age of my audience. I had done enough signings, enough tours, had met enough people that I knew the age grouping of most of my readers. And I knew that 1984 would carry a lot more weight with them than 1976, 1977. So while the pop culture references that Timmy and his friends are into, while I was familiar with them, you know, they were the stuff that our little brothers and little sisters were watching. You know, Transformers, G.I. Joe, stuff like that. So yeah, that was done by design. Um, and as I said, you know, I took a lot of fictional liberties, but there is so very much of me in the character of Timmy Greco, and so much of my childhood in the overall plot and the things happening in the background. Um, it's interesting. On set, Nolan really absorbed the character of Timmy uh, to the point where at the premiere, uh, Mary said, it's like watching adult you hang out with little you. She was referring to Nolan and I hanging out. I think this was right after he and I had decided to pelt the paparazzi with snowballs, which we did. Um, you know, he was a good kid. Now a fine adult, fine young man, actor. Um, but yeah, it was very strange at times to watch him on camera and even off camera on set. Um, it was like a little version of me, and that's not who he actually is in real life. So he really did become the character, which was, of course, based on me. Uh, just a strange Ouroboros of art. So yeah, that was the other things I wanted to add. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Uh, Next time, we're going to get to The Rising, Death in Four Colors, which is one most of you probably have not seen. We'll see you then. Peace.